Story 1. Slaughterhouse 5. No other book has influenced the way I view the world to the same degree. It helps that I read it at a formative 17 years old the first time. Story 2. I really enjoyed Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogy. That author really knows how to build a unique world. Every one of his series feels like a whole strange new place, and he just does a really good job of drawing you into the world. He also really likes unique magic systems in his books. The magic systems in Mistborn all revolve around metals that give different powers. Some people can eat metals and burn them, others need to wear particular metals and can store attributes, like being really weak and sick for a while to store up healing powers, and a third group has to be staked with spikes of certain metals to gain supernatural abilities through super secret spoiler stuff. Story 3. The Lord of the Rings. Read it as a teenager and loved it. Read it again every decade after that. Each time I read it, I get something new out of it, and it remains timeless. Story 4. I'm not a huge reader, but I can tell you that the Game of Thrones books are amazing. And if you read them while watching the show at the same time for the first few seasons, where they still closely follow each other, it makes the experience so much better. Want to know why the dialogue is so good in the first few seasons of the show? All the super quotable lines are taken verbatim from the book. Awesome stuff. Story 5. Gosh, I don't know. I loved Angela's Ashes. I got so sucked into that book that I was surprised one day when my sister called to tell me food was ready. And I was so thankful to just have food to eat. Story 6. Hiroshima, John Hersey. If you've ever had doubts about the immorality of nuclear weapons and the indiscriminate targeting of civilians in war, you won't after this one. Story 7. Singular book? Probably 1984. Series? Realms of the Elderlings. Particularly the Tawny Man trilogy, but you have to finish the other two trilogies before you get to that to enjoy it. Story 8. No Way I Can Pick One. Unbroken was amazing. In Harm's Way taught me things about the sinking of the Indianapolis I never knew. I think 1984 was prophetic. Animal Farm and Fahrenheit 451 keep me awake now. For those who think they don't like to read, The Watchers by Dean Koontz. Story 9. Beauty and Sadness, Yasunari Kawabata. Loved all of his books, to be fair. Snow Country, The Lake, and House of the Sleeping Beauties are all amazing books, too. A lot of people have probably read House of the Sleeping Beauties already without knowing under the title Memories of My Melancholy Horrors by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, author of Love in the Time of Cholera. His book was published about 50 years after Kawabata's work and is not just inspired by it. It's a blatant ripoff. If you keep in mind that it's a product of its time, I also really enjoyed Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night. Well worth a read. Story 10. Well, I recently finished No Country for Old Men and loved it. But besides that, I've always enjoyed Wuthering Heights. Any book that gets my adrenaline pumping ends up being a favorite. Story 11. I hate that George R. Martin hasn't finished A Song of Ice and Fire because his writing in books 1 to 5 is absolutely beautiful. If he dies, I hope no one tries to finish it because the writing will not be the same. Story 12. Honestly, the best book I've read this year is a book called Hungry Ghosts by Joe Fisher. It was gripping. The second best is I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb. Third, I'd say Devil in the White City was pretty good. Story 13. A Storm of Swords was the most gripping and page-turning book I have read. A series of unfortunate events inspired my love for words, definitions, and etymology in general. The Chrysalids was also pretty impactful in my youth. Story 14. And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. It is the only thriller novel in which even if you read the last page by chance, you would still not be able to guess who the killer is. Story 15. My War Gone By. I Miss It So by Anthony Lloyd or Angel of Grozny by Asni Seierstad were really good if you like war documentaries. For fiction, The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova or Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami are some of the best ones I've read. Story 16. Gentleman Bastard series. Just a fun read with amazing characters. Is it a literary masterpiece? No, just great entertainment. Been through the first 3 6 times now. Good Lord, Mr. Lynch, hurry up with book 4 please. Story 17. The first book I read voluntarily was the book about Pablo Escobar that was written by his brother Roberto. I think his name was endlessly interesting, depressing, and unbelievable. Also, I would recommend the book Killing Pablo to make sure you read up on both ends of the bias spectrum. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Story 18. La guerre contre les virus by Jean-François Saluzzo. A very nerdy book choice, I admit, but this has shaped my passion for infectious diseases and my academic and career path. Very entertaining, but you have to know French. I'm unsure if it was translated into English. Story 19. Fierce Invalids Home from Hot Climates by Tom Robbins. Masterpiece of a book by an author in love with language, humor, and an insightful perspective into mankind on a spiritual level. Story 20. Los renglones torcidos de Dios de Torquato Luca de Tena. Both Crooked Lines. This is one of the best books ever. A woman enters a mental institution, but you don't know if she is crazy or telling the truth. I read it 2 times and still don't know. Avoid the movie. Rimas y leyendas de Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer. Rhymes and Legends. Master literature from a genius writer. You can read this 1,000 times. El maestro Juan Martínez que estaba allí de Chávez Novales. Tells the story of a flamenco dancer and his wife and how they lived through the rise of the Soviet Union. It's sometimes funny as can be and sometimes extremely hard. Sin noticias de Gurb de Eduardo Mendoza. No word from Gurb. This one is hilarious. It tells the story of an alien that crashes his spaceship in modern Barcelona. Story 21. Fiction. State of Fear by Michael Crichton, my favorite fiction author. Non-fiction Matthew Perry's Friends, Lovers, and The Big Terrible Thing. I read it in one day on a cruise ship 2 years ago, and not a week goes by that I do not think about it. Story 22. It may not be a singular book, but the Gentleman Bastard series is just so good. I love how Scott Lynch does world building because it feels like every single thing in the books means something. The more you read them, the more you realize that, oh, that little conversation is actually the gateway to an entire plotline. Also, the twists are so well done, though they may be a lot for some. Story 23. My all-time favorite in hard science fiction is Dragon's Egg by Robert L. Forward. It's kind of a mind-bending setting with life on the surface of a neutron star with interactions from humans orbiting. The science is convincing, and the story is great. There is a follow-up book as well, which is not nearly as good, but it's still a great read. Story 24. The Sheep Look Up by John Brunner is one of the best science fiction novels of all time and proves to be scarily accurate in depicting how the world would deteriorate in the coming decades. Story 25. It might not be my all-time favorite, but it's definitely the first to come to mind, and I'm having trouble shaking it. Perdido Street Station by China Miéville. It's just one of the best examples, in my opinion, of his writing. He is truly a titanic world builder and storyteller. If you haven't read anything by him, honestly grab anything you can get your hands on and get into it. Story 26. The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. It has a deep, encouraging love for beauty and magic that I have found in no other book so far. It completely redefined my idea of what beauty and magic are and helped me find both in my everyday life. Story 27. Everyone recoils when I say it's my favorite book, assuming I only like it because of the aesthetics surrounding it, but it is truly a masterpiece in manipulation. Knowing the history of the book is so important. Nabokov spent 5 years constantly writing and crafting the novel, making Humbert the perfect unreliable narrator. Also, it's important to note that Nabokov never wanted a young woman to be on the cover, was vehemently against movie adaptations, and tried not to want it to be used in nefarious ways. Keeping this in mind, Lolita is an incredible story. From the very first line, you are welcomed into Humbert's psyche, how he views Dolores, how he's romanticized her, while simultaneously being presented with the reality of his sick obsession. She was low, plain low, in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. Humbert never tries to hide his perversion, but hopes that his twisting of reality and beautiful poetic language will distract and entice the reader. I could go on and on about how much I adore this book, but the main thing I love is after I read it, It changed how I view information presented to me, and I look at things more carefully. Story 28. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has stayed with me through the years. I enjoyed reading it as an English major, and I have enjoyed teaching it as an English professor. Timeless themes of rejection and loneliness, as well as the larger question of just because we can do a thing, does it follow that we should do that thing? Story 29. My grandma recommended it to me, saying it's a book about the building of a church in the Middle Ages. I knew she was going to ask me if I had read it constantly, so I figured I'd try to read at least the first few chapters. It's amazing. Love and hate and sex and war and political corruption, beauty and death and strife, all relayed in vivid detail. It's a perfect book. Story 30. Probably The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Maybe Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Possibly A Peace to End All Peace. The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. For literature, there are too many to choose from. It's probably Gravity's Rainbow, because it's in homage to Richard Farina, specifically, Been Down So Long It Looks Like Up to Me. Farina's book was a big influence in my youth, but there's something arresting about Wise Blood and The Adventures of Augie March. Story 31. It is definitely Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss. One of the greatest pieces of fiction written by the second best author of all time, behind Roald Dahl, of course. Story 32. I will not call it the best book I have read, but one of the most influential books in my life was Tado-chan, The Little Girl by the Window by Tetsuko Kuroyanagi. Story 33. I love 100 Years of Solitude, but weirdly, Wuthering Heights was the best in a sense that I hate everyone in that book. It was the first and last time fictional characters made me feel so much misery and hatred. Story 34. Probably not a popular one, but my favorite is Louis L'Amour's autobiography Education of a Wandering Man. It speaks to me as someone who has a strong desire to travel on the less trodden side of life while seeking great knowledge. I also love the turn-of-the-century setting when technology and culture are really shifting, but there are characters from seemingly many phases of history. Story 35, The Blade Itself. I mostly only read fantasy anyway, but most of the books I've read over the past few years have been mediocre at best. It may have just been a happy surprise, to be honest, but the cadence of the writing and the character development really drew me in. Story 36. Maybe not the best book, but The Time Traveler's Wife is much more than a sappy romance novel. The plot is so interesting. It's the only book I've ever been so captivated with that I continued to read it while blind drunk. I read like 40 pages on a train platform, and let me tell you, it was not easy. Story 37. I believe if you are an avid reader, it is impossible to have one favorite, like having a favorite song impossible. Perhaps a top 5 is more realistic. A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. Peace Like a River by Leif Enger. The Tenderness of Wolves by Steph Penny. The Whistling Season by Ivan Doig. The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. Story 38. Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. The Dark Elf by R.A. is Salvatore. Druss the Legend or just the Draenei series, Raymond E. Feist's Wizard was great, but I'll tell you about the first book I ever read. I was skipping English class in year 9, so I decided to go to the library. My history teacher saw me there and said, "Aren't you supposed to be in English?" I said, "Yes, I'm just choosing a book." And she looked right beside her and picked out a book called The Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. So I grabbed it, and she said, "Yep, that's a good book. Read that one." So there I was, stuck, and I had to read it because I think she wanted to talk about it after I'd read it. Anyway, I finished the whole bloody thing and then, right at the end, found out that the story didn't end and there were another 4 books after that. Ripped off. Story 39. Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. For the longest time, I considered this a favorite, but then I read more books and it drifted to the back of my list. However, I recently revisited it, and it's amazing. Story 40. The best book ever? It would have to be a classic unless you do not read many books. For me, it would probably be something like War and Peace, Huckleberry Finn, Pride and Prejudice, The Great Gatsby, Great Expectations, Frankenstein, A Tale of Two Cities, David Copperfield, The Scarlet Letter, Catcher in the Rye, Moby Dick, maybe 1984, and Slaughterhouse-Five, To Kill a Mockingbird. Reading these classic books makes you quickly realize why they were classics. Of all of these, I think I would personally choose Pride and Prejudice. Not the greatest novel in this list maybe, but probably the one I most enjoyed. Story 41, Crucible, The Trial of Cyric the Mad. It's not a profound book. It's not a universally celebrated book. It's fun. It only makes sense if you read the preceding 4 books in the series, at least one of which is a slog. If you are into Dungeons and Dragons, though, this book here, Book 5 of the Avatar series, is quite memorable and fun to read. Story 42. I don't read books. I watch the movies or shows. I only read a book if I need to for school, and I still won't read more than a few chapters because I could get the same information in 2 hours by watching the movie. Story 43. I really like history, so I really enjoyed the book Project 1065. I read it back in 8th grade, so it's not a very difficult read, but I love the story. It follows a young boy who plays the role of a spy for the Allied forces during World War II. He is infiltrating the Hitler Youth program to try and find information that can be used against Germany, as well as retrieving intel from an Allied pilot whose plane was shot down. The author also wrote a book called Prisoner B-3087, which follows a young boy's journey through concentration camps. Also a good book, based on the story of Jack Gruner. Story 44. I really like Unwind. It's a cool young adult book about if parents could basically abort their teenagers. Follow a bunch of people who try to survive until they're 18.